What broke you also built you, and that statement is far more unsettling and far more hopeful than it first appears, because embedded in it is a truth most people spend their lives running from, that the very experiences you resent, the moments that nearly destroyed you, the failures you replay in your mind at night, are not evidence of your weakness, but proof that you were placed into a confrontation with reality itself, and reality, when it collides with you fully, does not arrive gently. It arrives with weight. It arrives with consequence. It arrives with pain. You didn't ask for what happened to you. That much is true. Life does not distribute suffering fairly, and it certainly doesn't wait until you feel ready. It hits you when you're vulnerable, when you're naive, when you still believe that effort guarantees reward and goodness guarantees safety. And when that illusion shatters, something inside you shatters with it. Your certainty breaks, your identity fractures, your sense of direction collapses, and in that collapse, you are faced with a choice that is never announced clearly but defines everything that follows. You can allow what broke you to remain a permanent justification for resentment, bitterness, and retreat. Or you can confront it, not deny it, not romanticize it, but confront it honestly, voluntarily, and with responsibility. Because the moment you turn and face what hurt you, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to organize the chaos. You begin to extract meaning from suffering. You stop being merely a victim of circumstance and start becoming an active participant in your own reconstruction. What broke you stripped you of what was false. It exposed the stories you told yourself that could not survive contact with reality. It removed the comfort of pretending you were stronger, wiser, or more prepared than you actually were. And that exposure feels humiliating. It feels like failure. But humiliation is not the end of growth. It is often the beginning of truth. And truth, while painful, is stabilizing. Truth gives you something solid to stand on when everything else falls apart. You see, people are not built in moments of ease. Comfort maintains what already exists. It does not create depth. It does not create character. It does not create strength. Those are forged under pressure, when you are forced to choose between becoming bitter or becoming disciplined, between collapsing inward or standing up despite fear. What broke you demanded that choice from you, whether you realized it or not. And if you are still here, listening, breathing, carrying your story forward, then something within you chose to endure. Something chose to adapt. Something chose to learn. You may not feel strong. You may not feel healed. But strength is not the absence of pain. It is the capacity to carry it without letting it corrupt your soul. And that capacity is built, slowly and painfully, in the aftermath of being broken. So when you look back at the moments that nearly destroyed you, don't only ask what they took from you. Ask what they demanded of you. Ask what they forced you to become in order to survive. Because hidden inside those moments is the architecture of the person you are still becoming. What broke you also built you, and that idea is difficult to accept because it forces you to look directly at the moments you would rather forget. It asks you to stop treating your pain as an unfortunate interruption in your life, and instead recognize it as a central chapter in your formation. Most people don't want to do that. They want healing without memory, strength without struggle, wisdom without cost. But life does not work that way. The structure of reality itself seems to demand that anything meaningful is earned through confrontation with difficulty. And when that difficulty arrives, it does not ask for permission. When something breaks you, it dismantles the story you were living by. Before pain, you usually believe that the world is predictable, that effort will be rewarded, that if you are good enough, careful enough, smart enough, things will work out. Then something happens that proves how fragile that belief really was. Loss, betrayal, failure, humiliation, illness, rejection. Whatever form it takes, it shakes you at the level of identity. You don't just lose something outside of you. You lose the version of yourself that thought they understood how life worked. That loss feels like chaos, because it is chaos. It is the collapse of a structure that could no longer hold reality. In that collapse, people often feel small, ashamed, and exposed. They replay the moment endlessly, wondering what they missed, what they should have done differently, who they might have been if things had gone another way. And that rumination can either poison you or prepare you. If you stay there too long, it turns into resentment, a story where the world is cruel and you are permanently damaged by it. But if you allow yourself to see clearly, you begin to notice something else taking shape beneath the pain. You begin to see that what broke you also removed illusions that were never sustainable in the first place. Pain is precise. It cuts away what is weak, what is false, what is inflated by ego or protected by comfort. It exposes your limits, and that exposure is humiliating because it contradicts who you thought you were. But humility is not the same as worthlessness. Humility is accuracy. It is the painful adjustment between who you imagined yourself to be and who you actually are. And accuracy, once achieved, gives you a foundation that fantasy never could. When you are broken, you are forced to pay attention. You can no longer drift through life on autopilot. The stakes become real. Your choices matter in a way they didn't before. You begin to understand that no one is coming to save you in the way you once hoped. And that realization is terrifying, but it is also empowering. Because the moment you accept responsibility for what happens next, you reclaim agency. You move from being a passive recipient of suffering to an active participant in your own reconstruction. Reconstruction is slow. It does not happen through grand gestures or dramatic breakthroughs. It happens through small, disciplined decisions made when no one is watching. Getting up when you don't want to, telling the truth when lying would be easier, choosing structure over chaos even when chaos feels justified. These decisions don't feel heroic in the moment. They feel heavy. But over time, they accumulate, they form character, they build a version of you that can withstand pressure without collapsing. What broke you also taught you empathy, whether you wanted it or not. Once you've suffered deeply, you can no longer look at others the same way. You recognize pain behind silence. You hear insecurity beneath arrogance. You understand that people are often fighting battles you know nothing about, that understanding does not make you weak. It makes you precise in your judgment and careful in your actions. It gives your words weight because they are informed by experience rather than theory. There is also a kind of courage that only emerges after being broken. Not the loud, performative kind that seeks recognition, but the quiet courage of endurance. The courage to keep going without guarantees, the courage to rebuild without knowing exactly what the final structure will look like, the courage to face uncertainty without collapsing into panic or denial. This courage is not natural, it is learned. It is carved into you by repeated exposure to fear that you survive anyway. Being broken also forces you to clarify your values. When everything falls apart, you quickly discover what actually matters and what was merely decoration. You stop chasing things that look impressive but feel empty. You become less interested in approval and more interested in integrity. You realize that meaning is not found in avoiding suffering, but in carrying a burden that is worth carrying. And that realization changes how you orient yourself toward the future. You begin to aim more carefully. You understand that your time and energy are limited, and you stop wasting them on things that do not contribute to growth or stability. You learn to say no without guilt and yes with intention. You become more deliberate, more grounded, less reactive. This is not because you are happier in some shallow sense, but because you are more aligned with reality as it actually is, not as you wish it to be. What broke you also connected you more deeply to life itself. Suffering strips away superficiality. It makes beauty sharper, gratitude deeper, and presence more meaningful. You notice small things again. Moments of quiet, honest conversation, simple routines that bring order to the day. These things may not look impressive from the outside, but they anchor you. They remind you that life is not only about peak experiences, but about sustaining yourself through ordinary days with dignity. You carry scars from what broke you, and those scars do not disappear. But scars are not wounds. They are evidence of healing. They tell a story of damage endured and integrity preserved. Over time, you stop hiding them. You realize they do not disqualify you from strength or leadership or love. They qualify you. They prove that you have been tested by reality and did not disintegrate. So when you look at your past honestly, you may still feel pain. That is unavoidable, but alongside that pain, there is something else: competence, depth, restraint, wisdom, resilience. None of those qualities appeared by accident. They were built, piece by piece, in the aftermath of being broken. And whether you recognize it yet or not, they are now part of the structure you stand on every day. Personal responsibility is an uncomfortable idea when you are in pain, because pain instinctively pushes you to look outward for causes, explanations, and blame. When something hurts deeply enough, the first reaction is to ask who did this, what went wrong, or why life allowed it to happen. Those questions are human. They arise naturally when order collapses and suffering enters without warning. But if you stay there, if you remain focused only on what happened to you rather than what you do next, pain begins to harden into something corrosive. It turns into resentment, and resentment, unlike pain, does not fade with time. It quietly reshapes your character. Taking responsibility does not mean denying that you were hurt. It does not mean pretending the injustice wasn't real or that the loss didn't matter. Responsibility is not self-blame. It is something far more difficult and far more powerful. It is the decision to accept that, regardless of how the pain entered your life, what happens next is now partially in your hands. And that realization is terrifying because it removes the comfort of victimhood. But it is also liberating because it gives you a way forward. Pain by itself does not make people stronger. That is a lie people tell to survive the idea of suffering. Pain makes people bitter just as often as it makes them wise. What determines the outcome is how you respond when you are hurt. Responsibility is the bridge between damage and strength. Without it, pain remains raw and unresolved. With it, pain becomes something you can work with, something you can shape, something you can transform into competence. When you accept responsibility, you stop asking life to be fair before you act. You stop waiting for closure, apologies, or perfect conditions. You begin where you are with what you have, even if it feels insufficient. That starting point often feels humiliating. You may have to admit weakness, ignorance, or failure. But admitting reality is not the same as surrendering to it. In fact, it is the first step toward changing it. You cannot improve what you refuse to acknowledge. Responsibility forces you to examine your own patterns. Pain often reveals habits you ignored when things were comfortable. Avoidance, dishonesty, passivity, dependency, these traits may not have caused your suffering, but they will determine whether you remain trapped in it. Taking responsibility means asking difficult questions about your own behavior, not to punish yourself, but to understand where you have agency. It means identifying the small decisions that are still within your control when everything else feels out of reach. Those small decisions matter more than dramatic gestures, getting up at a consistent time, keeping your word even when it's inconvenient, taking care of your body when neglect feels justified, speaking truthfully when silence would be safer. These actions do not erase pain, but they introduce order into chaos. And order is what allows strength to emerge. Strength is not an emotion. It is a structure built through repeated acts of responsibility. There is something deeply stabilizing about carrying responsibility during suffering. It gives pain boundaries. It prevents it from consuming your entire identity. When you take responsibility, you are no longer just someone who was hurt. You are someone who is responding. That shift changes how you see yourself. You move from helplessness to participation. You begin to trust yourself again, not because you feel confident, but because you are behaving in ways that deserve trust. Responsibility also sharpens perception. When you stop blaming everything outside of you, you become more attentive to cause and effect. You notice how your actions influence your emotions, how your routines shape your mindset, how your choices accumulate over time. This awareness is not always comfortable. It forces you to confront the fact that some of your suffering may be prolonged by what you avoid rather than what you endure. But that realization gives you leverage. And leverage is what allows change. Transforming pain into strength requires patience, because responsibility does not produce immediate relief. In the beginning, it often feels like additional weight placed on an already exhausted system. You may wonder why you should carry more when you are already overwhelmed. But responsibility is not an extra burden. It is a way of organizing the burden you already have. Without it, pain spills into every corner of your life. With it, pain becomes contained, manageable, and eventually instructive. There is also a moral dimension to responsibility that people often overlook. When you take responsibility for your own healing and growth, you reduce the likelihood that your unresolved pain will spill onto others. You become less reactive, less defensive, less likely to pass on what was handed to you. In that sense, responsibility is not just self-serving. It is an act of restraint. It is a decision to break cycles rather than repeat them. As you continue to act responsibly in the presence of pain, something subtle begins to happen. You develop respect for yourself, not the inflated kind that demands admiration, but the quiet kind that comes from knowing you did not abandon yourself when things were hard. That self-respect becomes a source of inner stability. It allows you to face future challenges without panic, because you have evidence that you can endure discomfort without disintegrating. Pain transformed through responsibility also becomes a source of guidance. It teaches you what you can tolerate, what you must change, and what you should never ignore again. You learn your limits not as theoretical ideas, but as lived realities. That knowledge makes you more deliberate in how you choose relationships, commitments, and goals. You stop walking blindly into situations that recreate the same wounds, not because you are fearful, but because you are informed. Responsibility does not eliminate suffering, but it prevents suffering from being meaningless. It gives pain a direction. It turns it into a refining process rather than a destructive one. Over time, you realize that the strength you've developed is not loud or dramatic. It shows up as steadiness, as clarity, as the ability to remain composed when things go wrong, as the capacity to carry weight without collapsing or demanding that others carry it for you. And that strength is not something anyone can take from you, because it was built through your own choices in moments when no one else could decide for you. Hardship feels like chaos when you are inside it. It arrives without warning, disrupts the patterns you relied on, and tears apart the assumptions that once made life feel stable and predictable. In moments of suffering, nothing seems ordered. Everything feels random, cruel, and unnecessary. You search for logic and find none. You look for fairness and discover how little the world owes you. That sense of disorder is deeply unsettling because human beings are built to orient themselves around meaning. When meaning disappears, anxiety rushes in to fill the space. Yet chaos is not simply destruction. Chaos is potential. It is the unknown, the unformed, the space where old structures no longer work, but new ones have not yet taken shape. When something breaks in your life, it is often because the structure you were using could no longer support reality. It failed under pressure. That failure feels personal, but it is often structural. And when a structure collapses, you are forced into uncertainty, whether you like it or not. Most people respond to that uncertainty by clinging desperately to what they already know, even if it no longer works. They repeat old behaviors, repeat old thoughts, repeat old mistakes, hoping familiarity will substitute for order. But chaos does not resolve itself through repetition. It demands adaptation. It demands attention. It demands that you slow down enough to observe what is actually happening rather than what you wish were happening. Within hardship, there is a strange and often invisible order trying to emerge. It is not obvious at first because it does not announce itself with comfort or clarity. It shows itself through necessity. You begin to notice what must be done to survive the day, what cannot be avoided, what consequences follow certain actions. Chaos teaches through consequence, not explanation. And if you pay attention, those consequences begin to form patterns. As you endure hardship, you start to learn the rules of the new terrain you've been forced into. You learn what weakens you further and what stabilizes you. You learn which thoughts spiral you into despair and which ones ground you. You learn which people bring clarity and which ones intensify confusion. This learning is not academic. It is embodied. It comes from repeated exposure to difficulty and the gradual recognition of what works and what doesn't. This is how order is born from chaos, not through sudden insight, but through careful observation and disciplined response. You take what is unpredictable and reduce it, piece by piece, into something manageable. You establish small routines in the middle of disorder. You impose structure where you can, even if it feels insignificant. And those small structures begin to hold. They become islands of predictability in an otherwise unstable landscape. Hardship also forces honesty. In chaos, there is no room for pretense. The mask slips because it becomes too heavy to carry. You are confronted with your actual capacities rather than your imagined ones. This confrontation can feel brutal, but it is clarifying. You stop overestimating what you can do and stop underestimating what you must do. That accuracy is the foundation of any lasting order. As you grow more honest with yourself, you also become more precise in your actions. You waste less energy. You focus more carefully. You learn to prioritize what truly matters because everything else becomes unsustainable. Chaos strips life down to essentials. It reveals what you can live without and what you cannot afford to neglect. In that revelation, a hierarchy begins to form, and hierarchy, when aligned with reality, creates stability. The hidden order within hardship also reveals itself through competence. Each time you handle a difficult situation slightly better than before, you gain evidence that chaos is not infinite. You discover that some problems can be solved, some fears can be endured, and some pain can be carried without destroying you. That competence is not abstract. It is earned, and it slowly transforms your relationship with uncertainty. You stop seeing chaos as something that exists only to harm you. You begin to recognize it as the space where growth is possible, precisely because it is not fully defined. Chaos challenges you to bring something new into being. It demands creativity, adaptability, and courage, not the reckless kind, but the disciplined kind that chooses thoughtful action over panic. There is also a moral lesson embedded in hardship. Chaos tests your values. When structures collapse, you find out what you truly stand for. It is easy to claim virtue when life is comfortable. It is much harder to maintain integrity when you are afraid, exhausted, or angry. Hardship exposes the gap between who you think you are and how you actually behave under pressure. And that exposure, though uncomfortable, gives you a chance to align your actions more closely with your values. As order slowly emerges from chaos, you begin to develop a deeper respect for structure itself. You no longer see routines, boundaries, and responsibilities as constraints. You see them as supports. You understand that freedom without structure quickly collapses into confusion. Order is not the enemy of creativity. It is what allows creativity to function without destroying the individual who carries it. The more you integrate this understanding, the more resilient you become. You are less shocked by disruption. You expect difficulty as part of life rather than as an exception. When chaos appears again, as it inevitably will, you recognize the terrain. You know how to begin. You know to observe, to act carefully, to build small structures, and to let order emerge gradually rather than forcing it prematurely. Hardship never feels good while you are in it. That is not the point. Its value lies in what it reveals and what it demands. Within the confusion and pain, there is a call to bring clarity, responsibility, and meaning where none existed before. And each time you answer that call, even imperfectly, you participate in the transformation of chaos into something livable, something structured, something that can support life rather than crush it. Identity is not something you discover fully formed inside yourself. It is something that is built, tested, and refined through action, especially when action is difficult. Most people believe they know who they are until life places a serious demand on them. Until then, identity remains theoretical, shaped by comfort, habit, and unchallenged assumptions. But when difficulty arrives, real difficulty, the kind that threatens your sense of self, it forces a confrontation. And it is in that confrontation that identity stops being an idea and starts becoming real. Difficulty strips away borrowed identities, the roles you played because they were convenient, the beliefs you held because they were rewarded, the confidence you carried because nothing had yet tested it. When pressure increases, these surface layers crack. What remains is not always flattering. You may find fear where you expected courage, confusion where you expected clarity, weakness where you expected strength. This discovery is painful, but it is honest, and honesty is the raw material from which a durable identity is formed. Confronting difficulty voluntarily is what transforms suffering into structure. There is a crucial difference between pain that happens to you and pain you choose to face. When you avoid difficulty, it does not disappear. It waits. It grows. It manifests as anxiety, resentment, and stagnation. But when you turn toward difficulty deliberately, you begin to shape the outcome. You stop being dragged by circumstances and start moving through them with intention, even if that intention is fragile at first. Voluntary confrontation demands responsibility. It asks you to admit that while you may not control what happened, you do control how you respond. That admission feels heavy because it removes excuses, but it also creates dignity. There is dignity in choosing to face what frightens you instead of numbing yourself to it. There is dignity in attempting to carry a burden rather than denying its existence. And dignity is a cornerstone of identity. Each time you confront difficulty willingly, you gather evidence about yourself, not opinions, evidence. You learn how you behave under pressure. You discover what you are capable of enduring. You learn where your limits actually are, not where you imagine them to be. This knowledge is grounding. It replaces fantasy with reality. And reality, while sometimes harsh, is stable enough to build on. Identity forged through difficulty is not loud. It does not need constant validation. It does not rely on external approval to remain intact. It is rooted in experience. When you have faced fear and survived it, you no longer need to convince yourself that you are capable. You know it not because you feel confident all the time, but because you have acted despite fear. That knowledge stays with you, even on days when doubt returns. Difficulty also teaches restraint. When you confront real consequences, you become more careful with your words, your commitments, and your actions. You stop making promises you cannot keep. You stop overestimating yourself to impress others. You become more precise. Precision is often mistaken for rigidity, but it is actually a sign of respect for reality. And respecting reality strengthens identity because it aligns who you think you are with how you actually live. As identity forms through difficulty, values are tested rather than declared. It is easy to say what matters to you when nothing is at stake. It is much harder when acting on those values costs you comfort, security, or approval. Difficulty exposes the gap between belief and behavior, but that exposure is not meant to shame you. It is meant to clarify. Each time you choose according to your values under pressure, even imperfectly, those values become integrated into who you are rather than remaining abstract ideals. Facing difficulty also deepens self-trust. Self-trust is not built through positive thinking or affirmation. It is built through follow-through, through doing what you said you would do when it is inconvenient, through staying present when escape would be easier, through accepting responsibility when denial would feel safer. These moments accumulate quietly, but they reshape how you relate to yourself. You become someone you can rely on. And that reliability is a powerful form of identity. There is also humility in identity forged through hardship. You become aware of how much you still do not know, how much you are still learning. This humility is not self-diminishing. It is stabilizing. It prevents arrogance, which often collapses at the first sign of challenge. A humble identity is flexible. It can adapt without breaking because it does not depend on being right all the time. It depends on being honest and willing to learn. As you continue to confront difficulty, you develop a different relationship with fear. Fear does not disappear, but it changes its role. It becomes a signal rather than a barrier. You learn to ask what fear is pointing toward rather than using it as an excuse to retreat. This does not make you reckless. It makes you courageous in a grounded way. Courage, in this sense, is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward thoughtfully despite it. Identity forged through difficulty is also deeply personal. No one else can give it to you. No one else can fully understand it. It is built in moments of solitude, struggle, and choice. That is why it cannot be taken away by criticism or failure. It is not based on image. It is based on lived reality, and lived reality has weight. Over time, you begin to notice that you stand differently. You speak differently. You respond rather than react. You no longer need to prove yourself constantly because you are no longer uncertain about who you are becoming. That certainty is not rigid or final. It is open-ended, but anchored. It allows growth without disintegration. Confronting difficulty voluntarily does not guarantee success in every outcome. Sometimes you will fail. Sometimes you will misjudge. Sometimes the result will still hurt. But even then, identity continues to form. You learn that failure does not erase who you are. It informs who you must become next. That understanding reduces fear of trying again. It keeps you engaged with life rather than withdrawn from it. Identity, when forged this way, becomes something you carry rather than something you perform. It is present in how you handle responsibility, how you face uncertainty, how you treat others when you are under stress. It is not perfect, but it is real. And because it is real, it can endure pressure without collapsing into confusion or resentment.